Hi students. In this video we're going to talk a little bit about contracts. More specifically, we're going to be talking about surrogacy contracts. So contracts and contract law is part of the law of tort or civil law. So we're not talking about crimes that would result in punishment. Rather, we're just looking at is this contract legally valid? Is it binding? Does it sort of make demands of the people who are part of the contract? And surrogacy contracts are going to be a bit interesting because they're part of the law that we haven't really sorted out all that well quite yet. And so they're sort of an interesting case of contract. But talking about them will give us an opportunity to talk about contracts more generally and sort of the philosophical principles behind them. So let's take a look at the case for today. The case is in regards to baby M. This is a case that was decided by the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 1987, and it got a lot of attention in the national news media. I've got a little diagram that I created here. So there was a couple, and they made a contract with this woman to serve as a surrogate mother, sort of father sperm, the surrogate mother's egg, and the surrogate mother has a child, and she gives it to the parents, the parents who had contracted with her. Then she takes it back, and then there's this legal battle, and we have to decide sort of where is the child going to go. Is it going to go with the surrogate mother, or is it going to go with the parents, the Stearns, who paid her to carry the child for them? All right, so the facts of the case are, we start in February of 1985 when William and Elizabeth Stern enter into a surrogacy contract with Mary Beth Whitehead that was facilitated by the Infertility Center of New York. In that contract, Mrs. Whitehead agreed to undergo artificial insemination using Mr. Stern's sperm, carry the child to term, bear it, deliver it to the Sterns, and relinquish her parental rights in return for $10,000. So they were covering her costs and that sort of thing, but they were also agreeing to pay her $10,000 to essentially relinquish those parental rights. A little over a year later, on March 27th, 1986, Mrs. Whitehead gave birth to a baby girl. Now, Mrs. Whitehead realized almost immediately after having the child that she couldn't part with it, and she became emotional when the Sterns discussed the name that they would be giving the baby. The Sterns planned to name the baby Melissa, and that's why we get the title of the case called Baby, in regards to baby M, so baby Melissa. They're sort of hiding her identity. Okay, so although she knew that she couldn't part with the child, she did surrender the child to the Sterns 3 days later on March 30th. But that night, Mrs. Whitehead was overcome with despair. It sounds like she was crying, sort of the whole time, basically, that her child had been taken. And so the next day she visited the Sterns in hopes of getting baby M back, at least temporarily. The Sterns, fearing for Mrs. Whitehead's well-being, agreed to return baby M to Mrs. Whitehead, but only temporarily, right? They said, we're going to come and get her back eventually. But when it became clear to the Sterns that they were not going to get baby M back from Mrs. Whitehead, Mr. Stern filed a complaint, which led to a 4-month baby hunt. So the police, I think, if you look into the details, it sounds like the police actually went to the Whitehead's home to get the baby back, and they sort of handed the baby out the window. Mrs. Whitehead handed the baby out to the window to Mr. Whitehead, who, fled the scene, and they end up traveling all the way to Florida to live with Mrs. Whitehead's parents, I believe. When baby M was finally found in Florida, she was returned to the Sterns. A trial ensued to determine whether the surrogacy contract was valid, and therefore whether it was enforceable. The trial court, so the initial ruling, was that it was. The surrogacy contract was valid and enforceable, so the Sterns were the parents. But that case sort of moves through the court. It gets all the way to the New Jersey Supreme Court, and where we get this sort of central legal question, right? Are traditional surrogacy contracts like this, man's sperm, woman's egg, the woman is carrying the baby, and then, delivering it to the man and his partner. Are contracts like this one between Mr. Stern and Mrs. Whitehead legally valid? Do they hold up under the law? So that's a question I would encourage you to think about, right? What do you think about a case like this? Should these contracts be enforced? Should they not be? And this is ultimately a contract about sort of like legal validity. The law doesn't, address these issues straightforwardly. And so what we would want to do if we were, lawyers, judges, would sort of be to look at the sort of the law as it is, figure out, well, what should we say given the current law about surrogacy contracts? But, we're not in that position, right? So in some sense, we might be thinking about this broader question, like, what should the law say about surrogacy contracts? Should the law allow them? Should it not? That sort of thing. All right, how did the Supreme Court of New Jersey rule? Well, they ruled unanimously that traditional surrogacy contracts were invalid on account of their violating sort of three different parts of the law. So first, they violate a statute that prohibits the use of money in connection with adoptions. So you can't, buy kids. That's one reason. Two, they conflict with a statute that requires proof of parental either unfitness or abandonment before terminating one's parental rights or granting an adoption. So here the thought is we would need to either show that Mrs. Whitehead was unfit, or two, that she'd abandoned the child before we terminate her parental rights. She obviously did not. She wasn't unfit. She did not abandon the child, and so they can't terminate her rights as a parent. And then three, the traditional surrogacy contracts violate a statute making the surrender of custody revocable in private adoptions. Right? So this, you might be familiar with this, which is where if you're going to give your child up for adoption, and you do that, you have a bit of time to change your mind there. And so the statute that allows you to change your mind, it makes surrender of custody revocable. That was another thing which the surrogacy contracts seem to conflict with. So here they're sort of looking at the law as it governs adoption and thinking, how does that law apply to the case of surrogacy? Are there parallels, are there not? And I think what they're saying here is basically like, we want to think about this case in very much the same way that we want to think about adoption, but insofar as what the surrogacy contract does is it seems like it's paying money, buying a child without the opportunity to revoke the surrender of custody, then they're not going to be valid. That being said, the court did give custody of baby M to the Sterns on account of its being in her best interest. So it sounds like there was maybe some question about, which, is split custody tenable? I'm not sure if they considered that, but let's say it wasn't. They said, like Mr. Stern contributed sort of half of the genetic material here. Mrs. Whitehead contributed the other half. So if we're not going to split custody, we're going to give baby M to Mr. Stern because that's in her best interest. Now, maybe that assumption, right, that they couldn't have split custody is wrong. Maybe there was some reason why they thought Mrs. Whitehead was sort of unfit to be a parent. There were sort of times at which there's some recording of Mrs. Stern in negotiations saying at one point, like, I brought the child into the world, I can take her out. Maybe there was a worry that Mrs. Whitehead was a threat to the child. I'm not sure about the details there. But what I do know is that this was the result. The Sterns got the child, but the Supreme Court of New Jersey basically said surrogacy contracts, generally speaking, are just not valid contracts. All right, we are talking about this case, or we're interested in this case, because it raises some interesting philosophical questions. One question it raises is a question about commodification. So one of the court's main worries was that legalizing surrogacy contracts would commodify children. That is, it would treat them like mere things that could be bought and sold. So it looks like a surrogacy contract, right? What you're doing is just like buying a child from someone, and that looks bad, right? The problem is that children aren't mere things, so it seems inappropriate to allow people to put a price tag on children. So that's one question we might ask ourselves about this case. Should we allow people to buy and sell children in this sort of way? What does that apply about surrogacy contracts? What does it imply about adoption? What does it say about blood and or organs? So those are other sorts of things that people often aren't really allowed to buy and sell. And we take them off the market because maybe we think, well, these just aren't the right kinds of things to be selling. I think it's interesting in thinking about, well, why can't I sell my organs? Why can't I make a contract to sell my, kidney or something? Those are interesting philosophical questions that are worth thinking about. Another kind of question, this is one that I want to focus on a bit, is consent. This issue of what does it take to give valid consent to something? So one worry in this case is that people can't validly consent to surrogacy contracts. In particular, maybe that mothers, right, can't validly consent to surrogacy contracts. Why would that be? Well, in order for a contract to be valid, that is, morally binding, both sides have to give valid consent to the terms of the contract. So if we're going to get a valid contract, and here I'm talking about moral bindingness rather than legal bindingness, just because I'm not a law expert, right? And so I think it's worth thinking about these issues in moral terms, right? That's sort of maybe the more philosophically interesting idea, and what we should say about morality maybe is the kind of thing that we should say about the law too. So in order for a contract to be morally valid, morally binding, both sides have to give valid consent. In order for consent to be valid, that is, to be morally binding, right, one has to be three things. First, they have to be competent. That means they have to have the capacity to consent. Again, this goes back to something we talked about in this section on moral responsibility. So capacity means, you have to be an adult. You can't be drunk. You can't be, a baby. You can't have Alzheimer's or something. You've got to sort of be mentally capable of agreeing with freely. Your consent has to be informed. You have to know what you're agreeing to. If someone's deceiving you about the terms of the agreement or something, then your consent's not going to be valid. Finally, it's got to be uncoerced. If someone's holding a gun to your head, the fact that you consent to do something doesn't make your consent sort of legally, morally binding. So one thing that's worth noting is that these three, when they're sort of combined, we've got a decision that's autonomous. So that is, it's sort of made by yourself. You, as a capable, competent adult, are making a decision. You've got all the information. You're not being coerced. That's really what you want. It's a clear statement of your view and your will. Obviously, that's reflected right in this pattern we saw when we talked about moral responsibility. So I think like autonomy is a lot like moral responsibility. It's got these sort of like three parts, right? Minimal rationality, that connects up with the competence, right? We're capable of making these decisions or being free. We've got to have the information, right? So that we really know what we're doing, and the lack of coercion or compulsion. So as we saw in the moral responsibility discussion, we need these three parts for responsibility. Well, we need these three things for valid consent. Why? I think because at the end of the day, it's because these three things, when we're acting with those conditions being met, then our decisions, our choices are autonomous. They're really the things that we want. They're an expression of our will. All right, so what counts as informed consent? I'm going to take a look at a few cases here and just sort of ask, probe and see what you think about these cases. So this first one, a doctor, Jack has a patient, Jill. Jack knows that Jill will lose her arms unless she's given some drug. Unfortunately, that drug will also render her unable to walk, which is bad because Jill loves playing soccer. After reflecting on what to do, Jack concludes that he ought to save Jill's arms, even if it means rendering her unable to walk. Accordingly, he encourages her to take the drug in question, but he doesn't tell her that it will render her unable to walk, because he knows that if he tells her this, she won't take the drug. Jill freely takes the drug and is rendered unable to walk. All right, so in this case, Jack hides some information from Jill. We might ask, has Jack done anything morally wrong? If Jill sues him, should she be able to collect damages? Those sorts of questions. Really what we're getting at is this consent valid? And the thought here is that no, right? There's this information that Jill would have wanted. She wanted to know that taking this drug was going to render her unable to walk. That way she could make her own autonomous decision about it. But since Jack doesn't give her that information, he doesn't allow her to make an autonomous choice. He, doesn't really get her consent to the treatment. It's not valid consent. And so I think, yeah, Jack has done something morally wrong. And if Jill sues him, she should be able to collect damages. Here's another case. Imagine that Bonnie agrees to be tackled by Clyde in exchange for $1,000. She knows that Clyde is 300 pounds, but she thinks she'll be fine. Let's say she does this on the internet, right? But when she sees Clyde in real life, let's say she's not so sure that she'll be okay and she wants to void the contract. Clyde ignores her plea and tackles her anyway. But what do we want to say about this case? Has Clyde done anything morally wrong? If Bonnie sues him, should she be able to collect damages? I think this case is a little bit trickier, but I think in a way it does a better job of matching up with a surrogacy contract. So in a surrogacy contract, Mary Beth Whitehead knew exactly sort of what she was agreeing to in principle, but rather what happened was she sort of went through this experience that sort of changed her perception of whether or not she could really do the thing she had agreed to do. So I think you might agree to be tackled by someone who weighs 300 pounds, you might think you'll be fine, but then when you see someone who's 300 pounds, you might change your mind. You might be like, oh, I didn't sort of expect to feel as nervous as I feel now. I'm not confident that I'm going to be okay. I'm not sure I really want to do this. And there's a way in which we have gained information, right? But it's not a kind of factual information, right? We can't just sort of write down what you've learned. Rather, what you've learned is more like experiential. You've got like a deeper appreciation for what it means to be tackled by someone who weighs 300 pounds, and that might change your view. So I don't have an answer to this question necessarily, but I do want to sort of raise it, right? Is the consent that Bonnie has given, is that morally valid consent? Is it informed in the right sort of way, such that Clyde, now that Bonnie's saying, no, I don't want to do this, can Clyde just ignore what she's saying and tackle her anyway? My inclination is to think, no, you can't do that if someone changes their mind at this point. You've got to respect that. And so, that would seem to speak in favor of Mrs. Whitehead's position, saying, well, she learned some information, it became more real, she's allowed to back out at that point. One last case. Imagine that years ago, Sonny signed an advanced directive indicated that he wanted doctors to do everything in their power to preserve his ability to walk. Sonny's doctor, Cher, knows that. She also knows that shortly after signing the advanced directive, Sonny became a Christian Scientist and began refusing medical treatment. If Cher is going to save Sonny's ability to walk, she's got to give him a shot, but he insists that he doesn't want it. She decides to give it to him anyway. All right, has Cher done anything wrong? In this case, morally wrong? If Sonny sues her, should he be able to collect damages? It seems to me like the answer is yes. If Sonny sues her, he should be able to collect damages. Cher has done something wrong. What is it? Well, although Sonny did sign this advanced directive, Cher knows that he's changed his view, right? If Cher's going to save Sonny's ability to walk, she's got to give him a shot. And he's insisting that he doesn't want it. It seems like, in this case, the fact that you agreed to something before you had this religious conversion, for example, doesn't mean that you're still bound to that after you've had this religious conversion. Now, if Cher didn't know anything about the religious conversion, if Sonny wasn't able to talk at this point, then I think that's one thing, right? Cher would probably be justified in in helping Sonny. But now that she knows he's had a religious conversion, he's changing his mind, he's saying something different, I think in that case, Sonny should be able to collect damages. So here I'm just sort of, acknowledging some of my intuitions about these cases. That maybe you have slightly different intuitions. I'm not sure. What are we supposed to learn from all this? These thought experiments suggest that contracts are sometimes invalid in virtue of the fact that one of the parties to the contract wasn't sufficiently informed about what they were agreeing to. So if you don't really know what you're agreeing to, when you make the agreement, then your consent isn't valid. I think that's maybe especially true in the first couple cases. In like sort of the second, third-ish cases, we get something like a transformative experience. So maybe we get someone agreeing to something before they've had this transformative experience, and then they sort of change their mind. So you might think that someone who's about to undergo a transformative experience, like childbirth, like a religious conversion, right? Like grasping in real time, just how big someone who's 300 pounds weighs. Maybe that's not really a transformative experience in the deep way, but it does give us some newfound appreciation. When people are about to undergo these experiences, maybe they can't really validly agree to do certain things after the experience. So the thought is someone who's about to become, is going to be a surrogate mother and about to have this child, maybe they can't really agree to give up the child because they don't really know what it's going to be like or how attached they're going to be to the child. Of course, there are objections to this, right? So people pointed out Mrs. Whitehead had children in the past. She knew what it was like to have a child, and so she should have known. I think it's too quick, right, for those of us who haven't had kids. I have children, but I haven't, birthed children. I haven't done the pregnancy thing. I haven't given birth myself, and so it's maybe inappropriate for us who haven't gone through that process to assume, hey, they're all the same. They all affect you in the same way. Maybe this affected her differently, and we should be open to that possibility, I think. All right, so that raises this question just about consent. So can someone like Mrs. Whitehead give valid consent to a surrogacy contract? If you think the answer is yes, then that's going to make you think that, well, surrogacy contracts should be valid, like they should hold up in court because maybe Mrs. Whitehead didn't, but they at least in principle can be validly consented to. But if you think no, the sort of childbirth process is this transformative experience, you might think people can't give valid consent to surrogacy contracts, and therefore surrogacy contracts shouldn't be valid as a rule of law. All right, a couple quick final things to consider here. One is this idea of exploitation. So one worry is that if we legalize surrogacy contracts, we would encourage or at least allow for the exploitation of women, especially poor women. Why is that? What's the thought? The thought here is that the more that people need money, the riskier they're going to be in trying to get it. So legalizing surrogacy contracts encourages poor women to take unreasonable risks in hopes of escaping poverty. The thought is, if you really need money, you might be willing to undergo pregnancy, even a dangerous pregnancy. Maybe somebody wants twins. Would you be willing to undergo that in order to make an especially large amount of money? What if you're in debt? So the thought is, when we allow surrogacy contracts, we allow people to do this thing that's sort of risky. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because maybe they don't really understand the risks involved. So again, I think this is sort of getting at this idea of consent. So this point here gives us another reason for thinking that some women might not be able to really validly consent to surrogacy contracts. This is maybe not so much that they're not informed, though that's like an element. But here I think the feeling is more like there's a kind of compulsion, like they need to get out of debt, and that's sort of like weighing heavily on them. And so they're going to make this risky choice, maybe with less than perfect information, in order to try and get out of that, the poverty. So that's maybe a case where their consent isn't really valid because they feel a kind of coercion or compulsion to do it. This question sort of like throws a kind of wrench into the scenario. So what if the law were to prohibit commercial surrogacy, right? So say it prohibits people from paying surrogates anything above and beyond, maybe a better way to put it, over and above the cost of pregnancy, delivery, and recovery. Would that prevent exploitation? So it seems like if there's no real financial incentive for being a surrogate, then you aren't at the danger of exploiting anyone, right? I give blood. When I give blood, they don't pay me, and I think the reason they don't pay me is to avoid potentially exploiting people who really want money, and so are going to give blood too much. They probably have all other reasons, like if they paid people to give blood, maybe people whose blood was who had sort of like some blood problems or drugs in their system or diseases or something, maybe they'd be more likely to give blood, and so the blood that they were getting wasn't as likely to be useful to them. But I mean, the details there are tricky, but we can see at least one idea here is that we can avoid exploitation by not paying people for blood or organs or children, things like that. This leads to this final point I want to make about sexism. So I think this is sort of an interesting point here. So a final worry we might have is that if the law prohibits surrogacy, or if it prohibits commercial surrogacy, then it's violating women's autonomy because it's preventing them from using their bodies as they see fit. So one thought is, you might say, well, I don't want to exploit anyone, so I'm not going to pay them. But some woman might say, no, like I'm an autonomous person. I can make decisions for myself. I would really like to make money, and by prohibiting surrogacy, you're preventing me from making money in a way that seems perfectly reasonable. I'm happy to make the money. I'm happy to take on the risks of carrying the child, and this family gets a child that they wouldn't otherwise have. So it seems like that's at least paternalistic, and if not sexist. So I guess I'll get to that in a second. So this seems like especially problematic, as I say here, if it's preventing women from making money using their bodies. The thought here is that these laws are paternalistic, if not sexist. So at least what it's doing is saying, like, no, you're not allowed to make decisions for yourself. That's paternalism. So what we think, we know what's best for you, and what we think is best is for you not to engage in these surrogacy contracts, so we're not going to let you do it. That's paternalism. Why would it be sexist? Well, the thought is it's a way in which sort of men are making the rules and they're deciding for women that they're not allowed to do this certain kind of thing. And the thought is that women should be able to decide for themselves what they're able to do. There might be this other way in which the thought is, well, women can't really be trusted to make decisions on their own. We can't, they're foolish, they're going to be exploited, and so let's just not allow them to make those decisions. Well, maybe we're thinking too little of women, right? We're not giving them the respect that they deserve. So, question on this point, right? Would prohibitions on surrogacy or commercial surrogacy be unjustly paternalistic? Would they be sexist? And then what does that say about prohibitions on sex work more generally, right? So I think this point that we're making here about surrogacy contracts can be is relevant to the discussion about should prostitution, for example, be outlawed? If women want to have sex for money, shouldn't that be allowed? Again, super controversial issue. Don't really want to get into it here, but that's the kind of, we can sort of see in this discussion of surrogacy how there are some implications for these other issues. And then I want to finish with this final question. Is there a sort of morally relevant difference between traditional surrogacy, the kind that Mr. Stern and Mrs. Whitehead were involved in, where there's sort of sperm from the man, an egg from the gestational mother, right, the mother who's going to be carrying the pregnancy to term, that's traditional surrogacy. And then gestational surrogacy, on the other hand, is a case where, you just get a sperm and an egg from donors, like maybe Mr. Stern and Mrs. Whitehead give their Mr. Stern's sperm, Mrs. Stern's egg, and then they sort of fertilize those in a lab, and then they put the fertilized egg into Mrs. Whitehead. There, the thought might be, well, you're not going to get. I think one of the reasons Mrs. Whitehead sort of wanted to keep her child was she thought, oh, it looks so much like my other daughter. But maybe, you use the sperm and egg from the Sterns and you don't get a baby that looks all that much like Mrs. Whitehead's daughter. Maybe she's not as committed to keeping it, and there's less of a genetic connection there. So I think gestational DNA, well, that's probably the wrong way to refer to it, but I think there is some like minor genetic contribution that a gestational mother makes to the growing fetus. But again, maybe that's not the point, but it's something worth keeping in mind. But anyway, is there a sort of morally relevant difference between those two that would make one of them less problematic than the other? So maybe we could allow gestational surrogacy and gestational surrogacy contracts, but not allow traditional surrogacy contracts. That would be one possible route that we could take making the law. All right, that's it for this discussion. As you can see, this case raises all sorts of questions that are interesting, and I look forward to talking about those with you in class. All right, bye.